The Miranda-class light cruiser served in Starfleet for over a century, spending the majority of this time in roles other than light cruiser as technology and firepower passed the ship by. The Miranda class was a highly adaptable design, and many variants and subclasses would be created over the ship's long service life. In this video, we will explore, in some detail, the common subclasses of the Miranda class, as well as a few of the more unique variations. This video will not cover variants of the Miranda, but only the main evolution of the class. A separate video on Miranda variants will be made in the future as part of Miranda Month. Look out for that. And with those provisos out of the way, let's take a look at where it all started. The original Mark I Miranda-class light cruiser. So the Mark I is the first initial version of the Miranda class to see service. The ship was developed in the late 2360s and would enter service from 2269 onwards. The technology developed for the ship would be used in most Starfleet classes developed in the 2270s and 80s, before the Excelsior class succeeded in breaking the transwarp barrier and resetting the warp scale. The Mark I would be built in significant numbers. There was an arms race going on with several of the Federation's neighbors in the period, and at the time, a Miranda was seen as having a better cost-to-capability ratio than many other ship designs then in service with the fleet. The Mark I would remain in service until the late 2280s, when the success of the Excelsior ushered in a new era of high-speed travel for Federation vessels. Wishing to make the most of their advantage over their neighbors, Starfleet would look around for any classes in production which would accept the new improved reactor designs and be able to handle the resultant increases in power generation required to get a ship up to the new speeds. Fortunately, during the development cycle of the Miranda class, all the way in the 2260s, the designers of the ship had taken then-future technologies in development under consideration and had built the Miranda class with the capability to accept a reactor of the new style. This meant that it was relatively easy to work out a refit program in short order. The Mark II would be born from this refit program, with all Mark I refitted to the new standard becoming Mark IIA, while all ships newly built to the standard would become the Mark IIB. The Mark II would be the final entry in the Miranda family to serve in the originally intended light cruiser mission profile, though the Mark III would begin as little more than a slight update to the Mark IIB hull and computer systems to fulfill the new frigate role. The Mark III would enter production itself during the 2290s. By this point, the originally light cruiser Miranda had been surpassed in size and capability by the newer Merced-class light cruisers built in the Excelsior style. But the design was still considered valuable enough, and so many were available, that Starfleet introduced a refit. More a software update, programmed to the class, put it through their computers and re-rated them as frigates. A type which typically performed many of the same roles of cruiser in Starfleet, but was considered less suitable for fleet action than either a cruiser or destroyer. Hence it made sense that you would re-rate a light cruiser to a frigate, as the Miranda had become a small light cruiser, basically a frigate. As touched on, the Mark III was in its first several variants little more than a software upgrade over the preceding Mark II Miranda, mostly aiding in the ship's power generation and reactor modulation efficiency. No significant upgrades to the ship's firepower or other abilities would be achieved at the time. In fact, the differences between a Mark I, Mark II, and Mark III are virtually impossible to tell from just looking at the ship's external appearance. Despite the upgraded performance, the different marks would enjoy from one another. This similarity to the first and second marks would hold true throughout all models of the Mark III, generally speaking, which itself would continue into production until the 2310s in favor of the improved Mark IV, the first of the destroyer Mirandas. The Mark III would be the last of the Miranda-class variants to be built as new, with all future variants and subclasses being rebuilds of previously commissioned ships. Starting in the 2320s, Starfleet began to look around for a replacement for the aging destroyers of the Aquila class, itself of the same vintage as the Miranda, in fact slightly newer. But this ship was much smaller and incapable of accepting the same refits the Miranda could to keep it current and competitive with the latest designs, at least where speed and firepower was concerned. It had initially been planned to build a totally new class of destroyer to replace the Aquila, but it was quickly realized that with minimal effort, the numerous and plentiful Miranda Mark IIIs could be refit to serve in the destroyer role at a fraction of the cost of a totally new design. The refit involved swapping out the ship's weapons, sensors, and shield generators for more modern versions. Tame compared to the near-total reconstructions performed as part of the Mark V and VI programs conducted a decade later. This would boost the ship's firepower, though the ship's reactors, a generation and a half or more out of date, did struggle to meet required power output in battle conditions for more than a few minutes. Starfleet was relatively happy with this refit program. It provided them with a single class which fulfilled multiple roles. This would be around the time that the first of many variants of the Miranda would begin to emerge, with Starfleet making the most of the myriad Miranda hulls they had already available in the period. Mark IVs would soon become Starfleet's destroyer of choice for the next 2 decades, replaced in the 2340s with first the Wombundu class and later Mark V Miranda destroyer refit. By the late 2330s, Starfleet was once again looking to replace the Miranda, the ships having been surpassed in speed, striking power, and shield strength by the latest generation of ships in foreign navies, with a few prototype destroyers produced by Starfleet also clearly demonstrating domestically how limited the Mark IV had become. The result of this was the Wombundu class, a capable, small and advanced destroyer design which began entering service in 2338, the class being developed in the same generation as the Rigel-class cruiser, which had been developed as a replacement for the aging Excelsior class. The biggest issue with the Wombundu class, though, would be that its cost in relation to a simple refit of the Miranda, in terms of manpower, time, and resources, was much greater despite the added capability and superior lifespan of an all-new design. And so Starfleet, undergoing the greatest period of peace in Federation history, would select this refit option. The refit program to convert the Mark IV Miranda into a new destroyer variant would begin in 2342 after a mere 40 Wombundus had been built, 6 of which were cancelled. The refit would amount to a significant internal rebuild of the class, introducing a new reactor, weapons, sensors, shields, and a new computer system which allowed the ships to operate with a smaller crew than previous variants. A key defining feature of the Mark V was the deletion of the iconic roll-bar torpedo pod from the ship and the moving of the new launcher elsewhere within the hull. The extent of the work, even in regards to building totally new starships, would prove too much for Starfleet in the period, though, and only a small number, when compared to the total number of Mirandas built, would be completed to the Mark V standard, with a interim middle ground Mark IV-F produced, which attempted to bridge the gap between the greater capability of the Mark V and the plentiful number of Mark IVs available. This was considered not a success. Aside from the 5 Miranda variants, several lesser specialized variants and divergent subclasses exist on the basic Miranda design. These subclasses, Soyuz, Istanbul, Antares, and Yorkshire, will be dealt with in videos of their own at some point in the future. But the other variations of the Miranda design will be dealt with here as well, in summarized form. Firstly, we have the largely theoretical Mark VI Miranda, a proposed life extension refit of the Miranda hull which sought to extend the life of the class by a further several decades, and practically totally replace the ship's internals with fully modern tech. This variant was proposed in the 2360s but not pursued as Starfleet finally had the funding to build dedicated, purpose-built new ships to replace the many Mirandas flying around. After this, there's a bit of a lull, which is ended with the Mark VII, otherwise known as the drone Miranda. This variant, the final version to see service, would be developed in response to the Borg threat to provide Starfleet with a cheap and disposable ship to throw against the collective. Essentially, swarm tactics. The type was still being developed by the time of Wolf 359 and would be put on hold after that battle, though many Miranda-class ships, demilitarized, demobilized, and placed in reserve, would later be refit to the Mark VII standard to fight in the Dominion War, where many would be lost. And there we have the main Miranda variations. Now we should mention that many lesser-known small batch designs and theoretical versions existed in the period as well, but these were mere blips on the radar of the Miranda story and won't be covered here today. In the next video in this series, we will look at the subclasses of the Miranda, as mentioned earlier, so look forward to that. This video was sponsored by my Patreons, which is linked down below. There you can support the channel, help the channel to afford higher production quality. At the moment, it is just me kind of muddying along with various assorted bits of Amazon reviewed tech that seemed like a good idea. With your support, I may be able to do more. I may be able to get a fancy intro. I kind of want a fancy intro. So, that could happen. Not pushing. It would be nice to have. I don't need it. But, you know, if you wanted to support the channel, it's like $1 a month. That's less than €1, less than £1, more than £1. Maybe? Anyway, if you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel. All of that fun stuff. Thank you for watching this far, the 2% of viewers that make it to the end. Welcome, congratulations, claim your prize, which is a Patreon membership, down below. Yep. Anyway, have a good day.